Good evening. Welcome to another edition of the 411 Talk Zone radio show. My name is Leon Jones, and this evening I'm going to do something different. Now, I've talked about politics for the last few months, which I will get back into politics. But tonight, I want to talk about something that is truly part of Black America, and there's some other Americans like Native Americans, Latin Americans. They have gotten into the mix as well. And we'll talk about Southern cuisine and soul food. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this topic up it's because it is the holidays. And generally, if you come up in a Black American home, many of us used to eat soul food. Now, there is soul food and there's Southern cuisine. Now, basically, a lot of your soul food came from the deep South. We're talking about Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. You can put Louisiana in there, but they have a lot of Cajun, which a lot of French descent is also part of Louisiana. Now, you can look at North and South Carolina, you can look at Maryland, you could look at Virginia. All over those states, you will find some type of soul food. Now, what is the difference between soul food and Southern cuisine? Again, basically, soul food comes from the deep South, and it was started in slavery by Black people. I mean, they used pork, they used beef, and they used other wild game as well. And when we deal with Southern cuisine, uh, you can put in other cultures, Latinas, Native Americans, African Americans. It's basically what the Northerners would call poor man's food. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the definition of soul food. Soul food is the ethnic cuisine of African Americans that originated in the southern United States during the era of slavery. It uses a variety of ingredients and cooking styles, some of which come from West African and Central African cuisine brought over by enslaved Africans, while others originated in Europe. So, as we look at soul food, we talk about how and where the cuisine originated. Now, some people would call it low class food because it's not like your filet mignon or your Chef Ramsay type of food, but it is classy food. I mean, I will be honest, when it comes to Black people, particularly your older Black people, we can get down with cooking in the kitchen. And I know we've been told that soul food isn't good for you. Well, the chemicals that are put in food, all food makes food bad. Why? Because they try to make the shelf life for food last longer, preserve the taste. But the bottom line is it's unhealthy. Now, soul food does use cooking techniques again from Central Africa, Western European, and you also have the indigenous cuisine of the Americas. Again, the cuisine was initially denigrated as low quality and belittled because of its origin. It It was seen as low-class food, and African Americans in the North looked down upon their Black Southern compatriots who preferred soul food. The concept evolved from describing the food of slaves in the South to being taken up as a primary source of pride in the African American community, even in the North. And we're talking about cities such as New York City, Detroit, Chicago, Baltimore, uh, Richmond, Virginia. Now, soul food historian Adrian Miller said the difference between soul food and Southern food is that soul food intensely seasoned and uses a variety of meats to add flavor to foods and adds a variety of spicy and savory sauces. Now, these spicy and savory sauces add robust flavor. Now, we're talking about, let's say, I just made cabbage not too long ago. Well, I've seen some recipes that white people created, and I looked at the seasonings that they put in it. Their recipes, I would never eat their food. They don't know how to do it like we did. They don't use the bacon fat. They don't use the sausage, the potatoes. Same with the green beans. And back in the days, we used to use lard, and we know how to use different seasonings. Now, the method of preparation was basically influenced by West African cuisine, where West Africans created sauces to add flavor and spice to their food. Now, something else that we do, and I do it, Black Americans also add sugar to make cornbread, while white Southerners say when you put sugar in cornbread, it becomes cake. Well, their cornbread is bland, and we call our cornbread Johnny Cake. Now, as far as immigration is concerned, European immigrants seasoned and flavored their food using salt, pepper, and spices, whereas we as African Americans add more spices and hot and sweet sauces to increase the spiciness or heat of our food. Now, Bob Jeffries, who was the author of the Soul Food Cookbook, said that the difference between soul food and Southern food is while soul food is Southern food, not all Southern food is soul. Soul food is an example of how really good Southern African American cooks cook with what they had available to them. Now, impoverished white and black people in the South cook many of the same dishes stemming from Southern cooking traditions, but styles of preparation sometimes vary. Certain techniques popular in soul and other Southern cuisines, i.e., frying meat and using all parts of the animal for consumption, are shared with cultures all over the world. Now, we have a word called etymology. Now, the earliest use of the word soul food to describe a type of cuisine was found in a 1909 published memoir of a former slave named Thomas L. Jackson, described as a church service where the congregation was served food. He wrote, "There are some, when preaching, only preach 3/4 of the truth, or less when serving up dishes of soul food to suit the palates of those they must please." The term soul food became popular in the 1960s and 1970s in the midst of the Black Power movement. Now, one of the earliest written uses of the term is found in the autobiography of Malcolm X, which was published in 1965. Leroy Jones, later known as Amari Baraka, published an article entitled Soul Food. It was one of the key proponents for establishing the food as part of the Black American identity. Now, those who had participated in the Great Migration found within soul food a reminder of the home and family which they had left behind after moving to unfamiliar northern cities. Soul food restaurants were Black-owned businesses that served as neighborhood meeting places, and that's where people socialized and ate together. According to the author Loretta Henderson, middle class African Americans embraced their blackness by preparing and eating soul food. Henderson wrote, it the culinary incarnation, soul food, was associated with a shared history of oppression and inculcated by some with cultural pride. Soul food it was eaten by bondsmen. It was also the food former slaves incorporated into their diet after emancipation. So therefore, for the 1960s, middle class blacks used their reported consumption of soul food to distance themselves from the values of the white middle class, to define themselves ethnically, and to align themselves with lower class blacks, irrespective of political affiliation or social class. The definition of blackness or soul became part of everyday discourse in the black community. Now, we have the style of food, and the type of cooking is celebrated in the month of June. It's called National Soul Food Month, and I didn't even know about that. But as we get down into history, we have to go back to the transatlantic slave trade. So during that period, enslaved people ate African foods aboard slave ships. These types of foods, and I'm going to give you pictures and an in-depth list of soul foods. If you're already black, you already know these foods. So some of these included rice, millet, okra, black-eyed peas, yams, legumes. Now, legumes, if you don't know what a legume is, peas are a type of legume, but the type of legumes that I'm talking about are kidney beans and lima beans. Now, these crops were brought to North America and became a staple in Southern cuisine. Now, one enslaved American aboard a slave ship recalled later that all they ate were yams on a voyage from Africa to Charleston, South Carolina. Slave ships provisioned with African vegetables, fruits, and animals to feed the enslaved people bound in chains below the ship's decks. Now, these items were later planted and used in the New World for food and cash crops. Now, again, I'm taking this off of Wikipedia. Wikipedia is not the best source, but I'm just giving you information on the history and what soul food, what and where soul food came from, and how it is produced and why we eat it today. Now, again, the items that were planted in the New World, they were known as cash crops. Now, the introduction of African American plants to the Americas that shaped the American cuisine was part of what is called the Columbian Exchange. Researchers from Mercer University Library said the food selected to bring to America were brought over for specific reasons. They all remained palatable long after harvesting and were thus ideal for use on a slow voyage from Africa. Secondly, they're all the edible parts of the plants that arrive in the American South, and therefore they flourished once they had been planted, hopefully by the slave in the garden space allotted to him on his owner's plantation. Now, another way rice, okra, and millet came to America was by enslaved American women on slave ships. And what they did, they hid the seeds of rice, okra, and millet in their braided hair as a precaution against an unknown future in the land where they would be forced to work. Now, something else that you need to know. The guinea fowl. Now, what is the guinea fowl? Well, the guinea fowl is a bird indigenous to Africa, imported to the Americas by the way of the slave trade. The bird was brought by the Spanish to the Caribbean and introduced to the south of what is now the United States in the early 16th century. Guinea fowl became a source of meat for enslaved Black Americans and eventually part of the subsistence culture of the whole region. Now, on American plantations, enslaved people consumed the eggs of the guinea fowl, as well as cooking the meat with the rice like their West Central African forebears. Now, enslaved Africans in the South continued to prepare their traditional dishes of guinea fowl and plant foods native to West and Central Africa. They adopted European and Native American foods and cooking methods to create new recipes that were passed down orally in Black families and later published in African American cookbooks by the end of the American Civil War. Now, again, most of us Black people, when we cook, when we talk about recipes being passed down, that is actually true because many of us don't go to culinary school and we don't use a recipe. But we know of fried chicken, we know of cabbage, we know of smothered pork chops. Now, soul food recipes have pre-slavery influences as West African and European foodways were adapted to the environment of the region. Soul food originated in the home cooking of the rural southern United States, or what we call the Deep South, during the time of slavery, and basically that used locally gathered or raised foods or other inexpensive ingredients. Now, some of them that you might have heard, you might think white people eat, but no, because here's what Black people ate. Rabbits, squirrels, and deer were often hunted for meat. And then you had fish, frogs, crawfish, turtles, shellfish, and crab. They were also collected from fresh water, salt waters, and marshes. Soul food cookery it actually began when Black people or Black African enslaved people learned to make do with what they were given to eat by their enslavers, which we ate leftovers and undesirable parts of animals such as ham hocks, hog jolts, and pig's feet, ears, skin, intestines, which white plantation owners did not eat. So soul food was created by enslaved African Americans who created meals out of minimal ingredients. Slaves combined their knowledge of West Central African cooking methods with techniques borrowed from Native Americans and Europeans, thus creating soul food. Also, pork and corn were two staple items in the United States for both slave owners and slaves. So basically, many of the foods integral to the cuisine originated in the limited foodstuffs that poor Southern subsistence farmers had at hand. Now, this in turn was reflected in the rations given to enslaved people by their enslavers. Now, enslaved people were typically given a peck of cornmeal and 3 pounds of pork per week. And those rations form the basis of African American soul food. So, most enslaved people needed to consume a high calorie diet to replenish the calories spent working long days in the fields or performing other physically arduous tasks. Now, the slave owners would have smoked ham and corn pudding, while the enslaved were left with offal, the leftovers, and scraps from meals cooked for the big houses. And the big houses were known as the plantation houses. And they were also called juba by the enslaved. So what happened is they were put in troughs on Sundays for the slaves to eat. The term juba occurs in numerous African language and folk knowledge records that early on it had the meaning of little bits of food. So Archaeological and historical research concerning slave caverns or slave cabins in the southern United States, that's slave cabins in the southern United States, indicates that enslaved African Americans used bowls more often than flatware and plates, suggesting that they primarily made stews and gumbo for meals using local ingredients gathered in nature, vegetables grown in their gardens, and leftover animal scraps rejected by their enslavers. Now, this process allowed enslaved people to create new dishes for which they developed a variety of ways to season and add spice using hot sauces that they prepared. Now, research shows that white plantation families more often use plates and flatware, indicating that they ate meals consisting of individual cuts of meats and vegetables that were not blended into one dish like the stews made by enslaved people. So basically, enslaved people living on plantations located along the Atlantic coast developed a diversity of foodways enabled by their access to seafood. So during slavery times, the Gullah people in the low country of South Carolina and Georgia practiced a fishing culture that came from West Africa, and they made canoes similar to the appearance or in appearance to the ones in sub-Saharan Africa. Gullah people passed down their fishing traditions and prepared meals of fish using local ingredients from the region. So developing fish dishes that are still a part of Gullah culture. Arthur Amy Lynn Young's research at the Mary Plantation in Louisiana showed the differences in foodways between enslaved people living inland versus those living along the Atlantic coast. So families in the coastal areas had access to a variety of meats from land and sea animals, especially those who lived on the coastlines and barrier sea islands. Inland slaves' choice of meats were limited, consisting of game such as rabbit, squirrel, farm chickens, pigs, and leftover animal scraps. Vegetables were locally gathered or grown in their gardens. Young suggests enslaved people living along the coast consequently had a more diverse diet than inland slaves. So this demonstrates regional styles of cooking soul food based on local ingredients. Now, Frederick Douglass, and this happened in my home state of Maryland, said in his autobiography that because enslaved people living on the eastern shore of Maryland near the Choptank River, which I do know where the Choptank River is, received the bare minimum in food from their enslavers. They fished for food to supplement their diet. They caught turtles, fish, and eels. Douglas wrote the men and women slaves received as their monthly allowance of food 8 pounds of pork or its equivalent in fish and 1 bushel of cornmeal. Another way they supplemented their diet was by growing vegetable gardens. So everything that you hear today all started in the eastern shore of Maryland because they grew corn, potatoes, peas, beans, herbs, and melons. They did not have fat or cooking oil to cook their food. Slave holders in Dorchester County, Maryland, rarely fed their slaves. So, to supplement their poor diets, enslaved people in Dorchester fished for food in the Choptank River and hunted game on land. The animals they caught for food included rabbit, turtle, duck, goose, turkey, pigeon, woodpecker, possum, raccoon, skunk, deer, and muskrat. And they also cooked and ate vegetables such as okra, corn, leafy greens, and sweet potatoes. And they grew all of those vegetables in their gardens. So from these various food sources, enslaved people created their meals. So researchers at St. Mary's County Library, located in Maryland, documented an African American muskrat recipe. Skin and disjoint the animal, soak it in salted or vinegar water for 2 hours. Put the pieces in a pan of water and parboil slightly tender, but not real done. Dust in a mixture of seasoned flour, salted and pepper it to taste, and fry in hot fat until golden brown. Black Americans in St. Mary's County created the recipes during slavery that were passed down orally in their families. So basically, to add heat and flavor to seafood dishes, enslaved and free Africans in Baltimore and the Chesapeake region of Maryland grew fish peppers in their gardens. So after the national emancipation, many African Americans got into the seafood industry. So by 1864, almost half of all watermen in Maryland were former slaves. They became skilled in netting shrimp, gathering oysters, and fishing. So during the American Civil War, some enslaved people in Maryland ate clabber milk, fish, and cornbread. And after the war, Maryland became known for its crabbing industry, and Maryland deep fried crab cakes became a part of the soul food cuisine. Now, enslaved fishermen in Virginia caught fish to feed their families and the slave community. The Encyclopedia of Virginia said if the history of free and enslaved black fishermen, enslaved workers also received the fish considered undesirable by whites, such as garfish, whose red flesh, Niemcewicz explained, is little esteemed, serving only as food for Negroes, and black catfish, which held less appeal for whites than white catfish, which was considered excellent. So enslaved workers also fished in their time off to supplement their rations. So at George Washington's residential plantation in Virginia, Mount Vernon enslaved cooks. What they did, they prepared cornmeal, pancakes, known as hoe cakes, or corn cakes, individual cuts of meat, and seasoned cooked vegetables for the Washington family, while the enslaved people primarily ate cornmeal and salted fish. Now, the diet of slaves in Virginia generally included meat from farm animals, vegetables, blackberries, walnuts, and seafood. And historical research at the Burroughs Plantation in Franklin County, Virginia, by the National Park Service showed that enslaved people there had a diet of cornbread, pork, chicken, sweet potatoes, and boiled corn for breakfast. Along the coast, enslaved people ate oysters and seafood. Booker T. Washington was born enslaved in Franklin County, Virginia in 1856, wrote an autobiography titled The Life or the Story of My Life and Work Up from Slavery that described the diet he grew up with as an enslaved child. Washington's mother was an enslaved plantation cook who basically, she cooked meals for white families. Booker T. Washington's mother cooked over an open fireplace or in skillets and pots. Washington and his mother and siblings ate out of pots and skillets, while white families ate from plates and flatware using forks and spoons. His mother prepared one-pot meals for her family using local meats, vegetables, nuts, berries, combining all the ingredients in a pot to make a stew. This way of cooking is still done in West Africa and continued in the southern United States with enslaved families. So enslaved people at the Burroughs plantation had a variety of vegetables with which to make stews. They were asparagus, beets, beans, black-eyed peas, carrots, cabbage, cucumbers, garden peas, Irish potatoes, kale, lettuce, lima beans, muskmelons, okra, onions, peppers, radishes, tomatoes, turnips, and watermelons would be planted, ripened, and harvested from spring to fall. Now, according to Chambers research, Igbo Africans influenced the foodways of Black Americans in Virginia. During the slave trade, about 30,000 Igbo people were imported from Igbo land to Virginia. Igbo people in West Africa ate yams, okra, poultry, goats, and fish for their food. So okra, yams, black-eyed peas, and other African foods were brought to Virginia and enslaved Igbo people cooked these foods and prepared stews as one-pot meals. Enslaved people fished for food in the Chesapeake Bay and prepared seafood meals in in uh, in Virginia. Now, in Virginia's nearby creeks and rivers, slaves caught catfish, crayfish, perch, herring, and turtles for food. White plantation owners in Virginia rarely provided food to feed their slaves. So, to supplement their diets, enslaved people relied on Igbo slave owners' methods such as hunting and fishing and foraging for food and prepared meals that were influenced by the Igbo culture. Chambers wrote, slave owners stinted the slaves, throwing the people back onto their own resourcefulness for subsistence. Now, in the 18th and 19th centuries, masters provided slaves with only the barest necessities. Weekly or monthly rations basically they consisted of salt fish and or pork, corn or cornmeal, and salt and perhaps molasses. So basically, the large plantation holders doled out salted herring as well as smoked pork and corn, which the slaves pounded and mixed with beans and boiled into what we know as hominy. Now, a few enslaved chefs had some degree of autonomy because of their cooking skills, such as Hercules Posey and James Hemings. Hercules Posey was the enslaved cook for George Washington at Mount Vernon in Virginia. Posey's dishes were so popular among elite white families that he had quasi freedom to leave the house on his own and earn money selling leftovers. So, according to historians, the dishes Posey made were influenced by West African, European, and Native American foodways. So he created dishes of veal, roast beef, and duck, along with puddings and jellies prepared in a way not unlike that of other chefs, but creating his own sauces and flavors. Posey was never given his freedom and eventually escaped from slavery. James Hemings, the brother of Sally Hemings, was enslaved in colonial Virginia and was the head chef for Thomas Jefferson. Hemings combined African, French, and Native American food traditions. Now, while enslaved, Hemings traveled to Paris, France with Jefferson while he trained under French chefs and learned how to make macaroni pie, today called macaroni and cheese. Hemings introduced and popularized macaroni and cheese in the United States. It later became a common side item in soul food dishes in Black communities. Sesame is an African crop that was brought to South Carolina in 1730. Again, sesame is an African crop that was brought to South Carolina in 1730 during the slave trade. So basically, Thomas Jefferson noted how enslaved people prepared stews, baked breads, and boiled their greens with sesame seeds, and they made sesame pudding. Slaves ate sesame raw, toasted, and boiled, and it was used as an ingredient for baked breads in colonial America, and it is still used in the present day. Now, some slaves grew herbs in their gardens to add flavor to their food, and other cooking techniques were boiling and simmering food in an earthenware or iron pot known as colonial ware. Salt, was used to preserve meats for weeks until consumption. So, to sweeten their food and beverages, slaves used molasses. They also made blackstrap molasses with a very dark molasses with robust flavor by cooking the juice of the sugarcane low and slow. Other sweet sauces created and used by slaves were sorghum syrup, similar to molasses, made by cooking the juice of the sorghum plant. Sorghum seeds come from West Africa by the way of the transatlantic slave trade, and they were grown by enslaved people on plantations in the New World used to make sweet sauces. So, according to the research by scholars at Mercer University, white plantation families initially refused to eat African foods prepared by slaves. Although in many plantation kitchens, enslaved African women were the primary cooks. These women passed down cultural knowledge of cooking techniques to their children. Older slave women were preferred as cooks by white plantation families because they were seen as non threatening, knowledgeable, and skilled in cooking. So, time spent in the kitchen was time that enslaved mothers could spend bonding with their children and teaching them about life. So basically, the women did the cooking so they could bond with their children. They taught them about the life, culture, and food ways. Now, in African societies and during slavery, women were the primary cooks. And the role of enslaved Black women in the kitchen and as mothers led to racist stereotypes, portraying them as mammies. Now, slave narratives reveal continued African methods of cooking, heating, and seasoning food, and enslaved people roasted and heated their foods using ashes from fire pits, a traditional cooking method in Africa. So, this method was passed down orally in Black families in the antebellum South, and slave narratives describe how slaves cooked food this way. So, the word ash was appended to the name of some of the food that was prepared in as ash cake and ash roasted potatoes. So basically, the enslaved people placed food directly on hot ashes or coals to roast or bake their foods. Pots and pans were also placed on the top of hot ashes and coals to cook food. So some slaves heated or cooked their foods by putting them on leaves placed on top of hot ashes. A former slave, Betty Curlett from Arkansas, told of roasting her potatoes on hot ashes. They cooked a wash pot full of peas for a meal or two and roasted potatoes around the pot in the ashes. Now, some slaves did not receive enough food from their enslavers, as some slaves starved and consequently were malnourished. House slaves and field slaves had different diets. House slaves ate the leftovers they prepared for white plantation families, such as individual cuts of meat like chicken, turkey, fish, along with pies and seasoned vegetables. So the slaves working in the field ate leftover animal scraps, offal, and whatever they could find in their environment. Some field slaves rarely ate regular hearty meals. So historian John Blasingame book published in 1972, The Slave Community Plantation Life in the Antebellum South, was researched from a collection of slave narratives. So, according to Blasingame's research, some enslaved people received the bare minimum in food and had to supplement their diets by hunting, fishing, and foraging for food. Louisiana slave records showed enslaved people ran away because of inadequate food and overwork. To survive, slaves stole food from their enslavers, killed cattle from nearby farms, and hunted and fished for food. Now, research from the National Park Service and Professor George Estabrook said that enslaved people supplemented their diets by boiling black eyed peas, turnip greens, and pork fat in a single kettle and serving the mixture with grits made from home ground corn. Slaves cooked up meals that satisfied their dietary requirements as well as their appetites. The black eyed peas were a source of protein, and the greens provided fiber and vitamins C and A. Boiling greens in a kettle produced a vitamin packaged beverage called hot liquor that was consumed by the enslaved during the antebellum era to maintain their health. White plantation owners ate the greens prepared by the slaves and left the green liquid broth for the slaves to drink, not realizing the nutrients was in the broth. Pot liquor, also called pot liquor, has vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin K, and iron. The enslaved and their descendants created healing remedies using pot liquors. Slave gardens were important in the slave community because it supplemented slaves' nutrient nutrient deprived diet because their slave holders did not provide enough food to feed them. Slave holders allowed their slaves to grow food in their gardens because it saved their enslavers money, giving them an excuse not to buy food for their slaves. So, some slave holders provided the enslaved seeds to grow their own food. Slaves also made money by selling some of their food they grew to their enslavers. Now, something you've heard of, and we blacks eat it, chitterlings, or known as chitlins, are clean pig intestines. They are cooked in a pot and seasoned. The food has been associated with enslaved black people in the American South. However, eating animal innards or intestines is practiced in other cultures such as Asia, Europe, and West Africa. The Hausa people in West Africa eat chicken intestines. Enslaved Africans in the American South continued their traditions of cooking, seasoning, and eating animal innards. Enslaved people added extremely hot peppers for additional flavor and spice to their chitlins. Cooking chitlins was time consuming. Field slaves slow cooked their pig intestines while they were working in a field. The parts of the pig that the white plantation owners did not eat, they gave it to the enslaved, which they used to season food and prepare one hot meal, soups, and chitlin dishes. Chitlins are considered a delicacy in other cultures. Due to the time it takes to clean pig intestines, chitlins were preserved for special occasions and holidays. Some cooked seasoned chitlins with onions, celery, garlic, salt, pepper, and butter. Booker T. Washington wrote that enslaved people ate chitlins during the Christmas season. Christmas in Virginia was a time when slaves hired to work on other plantations came home to visit their families at their enslavers' plantations. So enslaved families were supplied with food that consisted of chitlins, sausage, and side meats. So after the American Civil War, cornbread, pig's feet, hog's ears, peas, and chitlins were prepared for Booker T. Washington's daughter, Portia Washington Pittman, 87th birthday. Now, foodways on the Underground Railroad. So again, some food seekers, runaway slaves, foraged, fished, and hunted for food on their journey freedom on the Underground Railroad. With these ingredients, they prepared one pot meal, stews, a West African cooking method. Enslaved and free black people left food outside their front doors to provide nourishment to their freedom seekers. The meals created on the Underground Railroad became part of the foodways of Black Americans called soul food. So, for example, Thomas Downing was born enslaved in 1791 on Chincoteague Island on the eastern shore of Virginia. So he learned how to harvest clams, oysters, and terrapin from the Chincoteague Bay, a lagoon of the Atlantic Ocean between Chincoteague and Assateague Islands, and prepared meals from his seafood. Downing left Virginia during the War of 1812 and traveled to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a city that had Black Americans working in the culinary industry there. He settled in the free Black community and found work catching oysters. So gained freedom in 1819. Downing, his wife, and sons moved to New York City, where the Hudson River provided work for New York's African American men working on the water, harvesting oysters. And by 1825, he had opened an oyster cellar, Downing's Oyster House on Broadway Street in the city's business district. Now, there he served raw, fried, and stewed oysters, oyster pie, fish with oyster sauce, and poached turkey stuffed with oysters in the basement of his restaurant. Downing and his eldest son, George, hid people who were escaping slavery and seeking freedom. Downing became known as the Oyster King of New York. And we get into slave recipes. So in the 1930s, the Works Progress Administration paid American writers to gather stories from the last generations of African Americans born into slavery that are called slave narratives. So, along the narratives are collections of recipes for sauces, desserts, and cooked meat and seafood dishes made by formerly enslaved African Americans. These records have been studied by John Blassingame, Michael Twitty, Jessica B. Harris, and other historians as they reveal the food culture and diets of enslaved people. The narratives show how enslaved people created new dishes that influenced Southern cuisine in the United States. The foods enslaved people prepared in the kitchens for white plantation families influenced the diets and cooking methods of European Americans. Now, research from slave narratives showed enslaved people cooked sweet potatoes by roasting or frying them in lard. Sweet potatoes were mashed and sweetened with molasses. A traditional soul food dessert in Black families for Thanksgiving and Christmas is what? Sweet potato pie. Enslaved people also consumed pot liquor, the liquor left behind after boiling greens. George Key, who was born enslaved in Arkansas, said, "We had made stew out of pork and potatoes, and sometimes greens and pot liquor. And we had ash cake mostly with biscuits once a month." Making pot liquor continued after emancipation. Jackie Torrance, an African American storyteller, remembers her grandmother making pot liquor from mustard greens, collard greens, pinto beans, peas, and white potatoes as gravy. Pot liquor was also used as a healing remedy to treat earache and ingrown toenails. And a former slave named Wesley Jones from South Carolina gave a recipe to make a vinegar based barbecue sauce using black and red peppers and vinegar. Wesley said slaves barbecued meats, often smoking and basting their meats with this homemade barbecue sauce. They would stay up all night cooking the meat. And other slave narratives describe barbecuing as a preferred method of cooking because it added flavor and spice to food. Slaves barbecued their foods for special occasions and on their days off. Henry Bland, who was a former slave, lived in Georgia and said slaves had July 4th, Independence Day off from work, allowing them to barbecue food, play ball, games, wrestle, and play music, which you get in the African American picnic of today. Now, a former slave named Callie Elder from Georgia said that her grandfather cooked catfish with lard, salt, and pepper and rolled the catfish in cornmeal before baking. Former slave Clara Davis from Alabama cooked catfish using tomatoes and potatoes or prepared baked catfish with a tomato gravy and sweet potatoes. Slaves in the South fried catfish in lards or other fats and seasoned their food with salt acquired from evaporated salt water. Enslaved people made use of fruits like apples and peaches that had been introduced to North America by European colonists. Some fruits, such as apples, were battered and deep fried in oil. Fruit fritters were also fried. Peaches were stewed. former slaves. Most came from Arkansas, and Rose Williams from Texas described eating goat. Mary Minus Biddy was a former slave from Florida and said enslaved people cooked goat in a smokehouse. David Goodman Gullins was a former slave from Georgia, and they prepared barbecued goat. Goat is a traditional meat in West Africa and was commonly cooked and eaten in the South by slaves. So enslaved people also barbecued squirrels. One recipe for barbecued squirrels that might have been similar to the way slaves cooked them was given in the 1879 cookbook. Put them in the oven, let them cook until done. Lay them on a dish and sit near the fire. Take out the bacon, sprinkle 1 spoonful of flour in the gravy, let it brown. Then pour in 1 teacup of water, 1 teaspoon of butter, and some tomato or walnut ketchup. Let it cool and then pour it all over the squirrel. Barbecuing and preparing barbecue sauce and hot sauce was done to season lower grades of meat. Enslaved people living near rivers and the Atlantic Ocean caught crab and made stews with the crab meat in a pot with okra, adding a sauce. Cooking seafood with okra is a traditional cooking method from the West African country that slaves continued on southern plantations. So, some of these recipes made by former slaves were published in African American cookbooks. So the earliest such cookbook was self-published in 1866 by Melinda Russell. That was 1866, not 1886. And that was by Melinda Russell as a pamphlet titled A Domestic Cookbook containing a careful selection of useful recipes for the kitchen. A cookbook published in 1900 in the city of Charleston, South Carolina, had recipes used by formerly enslaved Gullah people. Many seeds from sesame, a plant native to West Africa, were eaten raw with sugar or milk. Enslaved people also made cakes, wafers, and brittles from them for former plantation families whom they called buckra, a Gullah word for white people. Now, archaeologist, historian, and former professional chef Kelly Fanto Dietz wrote a book, Bound to the Fire, How Virginia's Enslaved Cooks Helped Invent American Cuisine. That said recipes prepared by enslaved cooks in Virginia contributed to some of the well-known fried and baked meat and vegetable dishes in American Southern cuisine. The foods from West Central Africa brought to the United States by way of the transatlantic slave trade were used by enslaved cooks and combined with North American ingredients using West African, North African, and European cooking methods to create meals in the 17th century, and they were necessary for survival that later influenced foodways of Southern Americans generally. Now, something that we do, barbecuing traditions. So enslaved Africans in the American South they basically contributed their own influence to the American barbecue tradition. The first people to barbecue food in North America were indigenous people or Native Americans. West and Central Americans had their own method of barbecuing food that they brought to the Americans and the West Indies. The Hausa people, West Africa, had a term for barbecue, babcake. The term is used to describe a complex of words referring to grilling, toasting, and building a large fire, singing hair or feathers, and cooking food over a long period of time over an extravagant fire. The blending of Native American and African styles of barbecuing meat contributed to the creation of the current barbecuing culture in the United States. So during slavery times, white plantation owners left the labor intensive work of preparing and barbecuing food to their slaves. Food historian Adrian Miller said the history of Black people and barbecuing during slavery, blackness and barbecue were wedded in the public imagination because old school barbecue was so labor intensive. Someone had to clear the area where the barbecue was held, chop, and they had to burn the wood for cooking, dig the pit, butcher, process, cook and season the animals, serve the food, entertain the guests, and clean up afterward. Given the racial dynamics of the antebellum South and enslaved African Americans, they were forced to do the work. The media in turn took note that a barbecue as a social event was a Black experience from beginning to end. And on 4th of July celebrations, the enslaved prepared barbecued food for white politicians and their enslavers. Now, enslaved people brought their own influences on the creation of barbecue sauce, hot and sweet sauces, and they were used in West and Central American cuisine to add flavor, heat, and moisture to food. So in 1748, Peter Kalm, a Swedish Finnish botanist, noted enslaved Americans in Philadelphia cultivated guinea peppers, and the pods were pounded and mixed with salt, preserved in a bottle to make sauces poured over fish and meats. Frederick Douglass Opie, writing in his book Hog and Hominy, describes the origins of soul food in Africa. American women cooked most meals. They cooked most meals, and when it came to meat, they did a lot of cooking of the meats over a pit and ate them with a sauce similar to what we call a barbecue sauce, made with lime or lemon juice and hot peppers. Slaves made up a large percentage of Texas population in 1860. So during this time, they brought with them the idea of cooking over an open fire and dousing meats with a sauce. That sounds an awful lot like barbecue sauce, what we do today. So after the American Civil War, a Black pitmaster named Arthur Watts brought his family's barbecue sauce recipe and barbecuing methods to Kewanee, Illinois, and became a well known pitmaster. So, in African American communities, barbecuing became a preferred method of cooking during Emancipation Day celebrations. Now, when we talk about emancipation on January 1st, 1863, Gullah people in the Sea Islands of South Carolina celebrated their freedom at Camp Saxton in Beaufort with food and barbecues. Black people in the barrier islands of South Carolina became free early during the American Civil War after the Battle of Port Royal on November 7th, 1861. So basically, many of the plantation owners and white residents fled the area after arrival of the Union Navy and Army. So as a result, over 10,000 African Americans became free that day. However, their freedom was not official in government writing until the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation on New Year's Day in 1863. So basically, thousands of newly freed Black people celebrated their freedom with food, song, and dance. Charlotte Fortin, the first Black teacher at the Penn School on St. Helena Island in Beaufort, attended the Emancipation Day celebration at Camp Saxton, and of course recorded in her journal the day they ate roasted oxen and barbecue. Susie King Taylor, a Geechee woman born enslaved in Liberty County, Georgia, wrote in her memoir that she had also attended the Emancipation Day celebration at Camp Saxton. It was a glorious day for all of us, and we all enjoyed every minute of it. As a fitting close and crowning event of the occasion, we had a grand barbecue. Now, other Emancipation Day celebrations were celebrated with a barbecue feast, a tradition that originated in the slave community. Now, after the Civil War, 4 million African American families were freed from slavery. They celebrated their newly won freedom with barbecues and Emancipation Day celebrations and prepared soul food meals. Now, 2 months after the Civil War ended in 1865, slave owners in Galveston, Texas, refused to tell their slaves the Civil War had ended and they were free. So, this is where Juneteenth comes into the mix. On June 19th, 1865, United States Brigadier General Gordon Granger and his troops arrived in Galveston and issued General Order Number 3. The order enforced the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared enslaved people in Texas they were free to celebrate their freedom. African Americans in Galveston and other Black communities in the United States gathered at public parks and prepared red foods that represent the color of freedom. These celebrations are called Juneteenth, which became a national holiday under the Biden administration in 2021. Now, you see what they did? That's what we do, celebrated parks. Now, according to the food historian Michael Twitty, the reason African Americans ate red food on Juneteenth is that it reminds them of the blood of their ancestors that was shed during slavery and the cultural colors of the Yoruba and the Bakongo people who were enslaved in the southern United States and brought to North America under the slave trade. Among the Yoruba and the Bakongo people, the color red represents power, sacrifice, and transformation. The red foods eaten at Juneteenth are watermelon, red lemonade, and red velvet cake. In addition to red foods, barbecue, fried foods, and other meals are prepared to celebrate the Day of Freedom. So, after emancipation, many Black Americans in the South became sharecroppers and cooked what was available in their region. This created regional styles of cooking with similar dishes passed down orally in Black Americans and Black American families. Again, so they started to develop their own style of cooking, and you see that Black people spread throughout the United States. Now, due to slave laws, it was illegal in many states for slaves to learn to read and write. So soul food recipes and cooking techniques were passed down orally until after emancipation. So the first soul food cookbook is attributed to Abby Fisher, entitled What Mrs. Fisher Knows About Old Southern Cooking, and published in 1881. Good Things to Eat was published in 1911 by the author. Rufus Estes was a former slave who worked for the Pullman Railway car service. Now, many cookbooks were written by Black Americans during that time, but as they were not widely distributed, most are lost. And now we get into the global. We get into the global. Let's see, did the barbecue, the emancipation. Now we get into the global spread of the African American cuisine, and that came along during World War I and World War II, where thousands of Black Americans enlisted in the army as soldiers and nurses. Some Black soldiers chose to stay overseas rather than return to the United States, where there were Jim Crow laws, racism, and lynchings. They were widespread. So you had African American servicemen and women open soul food restaurants in Europe, Korea, Vietnam, Thailand, and Japan, and introduced African American cuisine to people in foreign countries. So in the 1920s through the 1940s, African American culture was popular in France. French people enjoyed jazz, African American dance, and cuisine. Food historian Adrian Miller said the global spread of soul food really took off after the end of World War II. After the war, recently discharged Black military veterans in the European theater stayed overseas to open and operate restaurants. At first, they cooked mainly for African Americans who were active duty military and serving at nearby bases. In some of the countries where the United States had a military presence, like France, Germany, Vietnam, and of course, Japan and Thailand, It was easy for these entrepreneurs to find cheap ingredients they needed for their recipes because the locals ate similar foods: chicken, greens, okra, pork, and sweet potatoes. Now, as we move on, the mid 20th century, so we're talking about 1950 to the present day, the introduction of soul food to cities such as Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and Harlem came during the Great Migration as African Americans moved to the North looking for work. Sylvia Woods was born in Hemingway, South Carolina in 1926. When Woods was a teenager, she moved to Harlem and worked in a Brooklyn factory. In 1954, Woods changed jobs and started working at Johnson's Luncheonette, located in central Harlem. 7 years later, Woods and her husband purchased the Luncheonette and opened it as a soul food restaurant in 1962, calling it Sylvia's Restaurant. Sylvia Woods became known as the Queen of Soul Food. Food historian Adrian Miller studied soul foods development in Maryland and in Northern American states. Soul food in Maryland's Black communities added local flavors from seafood from the Chesapeake Bay. So people in Maryland, fried chicken. People who lived in Maryland, they had Maryland fried chicken. Uh, what what Maryland fried chicken is you take the fried chicken, you cook it in a frying pan in shallow fat. You cover it with a lid, thus frying and steaming the chicken, which was served with waffles. This is where chicken and waffles was born, and it became a common soul food item to eat in the Black communities of Maryland and in Harlem, New York. Now, during the blues and jazz era, musicians and singers performed and practiced late into the night and stopped at the Black-owned restaurants for food where cooks prepared fried chicken and waffles to their customers. Nightclubs in Black communities in the United States during the Jim Crow era were called the Chitlin Circuit, named after the dish that was usually associated with Black Southerners and soul food. The Chitlin Circuit was given its name by entertainers because it included Black-owned clubs that served chitlins and soul food. Now, during the Civil Rights Movement, soul food restaurants were places where civil rights leaders and activists met to discuss and strategize their civil rights protests and ideas for implementing social and political change. Parcells Restaurant in Atlanta, like George's Gilmore Eatery in Montgomery, had an important part in the civil rights movement. So basically, upon returning to Atlanta from Montgomery, Martin Luther King got permission to bring his team members and guests to Parcells to eat, meet, rest, plan, and strategize. Now, the Atlanta History Center said throughout the civil rights movement in Atlanta, soul food restaurants were the hubs of change where civil rights leaders could convene, converse, strategize, and in times of terror and violence, these places were retreats where leaders could plan their next tactical moves, giving many of these spots a legacy beyond good cooking. Soul food restaurants in Atlanta, Georgia, served as the primary meeting places for numerous civil rights leaders and supporters of the movements. Many politicians and civil rights leaders gathered to discuss for numerous civil rights leaders and supporters of the movement. Many politicians and civil rights leaders, they stopped at Parcells Restaurant, not just to strategize their plan and marches. They wanted to get good food. And Parcells Restaurant is on West Hunter Street in Atlanta. And in the 1950s and 1960s, you had civil rights icons such as Andrew Young, John Lewis, Martin Luther King Jr., Julian Bond, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., and Jesse Jackson frequently visited the restaurant, staying late into the night talking about civil rights strategies and politics. So several soul food restaurants were located on West Hunter Street because Jim Crow laws restricted where African Americans were allowed to operate their businesses. So in 1963, a few days before the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in Washington, D.C., where Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, King ate at a soul food restaurant called the Florida Avenue Grill. Now, during the years of the Civil Rights Movement, other civil rights leaders and activists met at the restaurant, planning and strategizing the movement. So before King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968, at the Lorraine Motel in Phoenix and Memphis, Tennessee, that's Memphis, Tennessee, he ate at the Four-Way restaurant and had catfish and lemon icebox pie. Throughout his civil rights career, King frequented several soul food restaurants where he ate and met with other local and national civil rights leaders. After King's assassination, riots broke out in Washington, D.C., and the leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Stokely Carmichael, asked the owner of Ben's Chili Bowl restaurant to remain open to provide food for police officers, student activists, and firefighters as they worked together to stop the riot. Authors Hoekstra and Kahn said in their book, The People's Place, Soul Food Restaurants and Reminiscences from the Civil Rights Era to today, that soul food restaurants served as places to bring communities and families together in times of trouble during the Jim Crow era, and it helped in the fight against segregation laws by allowing white and black people to eat together. Now, of course, there's all kinds of influence. You can find this information on Wikipedia, but what I want to do is, and I'll put this link at the bottom of my video, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to show you a list of soul foods and dishes. And here's a list. Here's right here. This is a plate of fried okra, chicken, macaroni cheese, and collard greens. This is apple pie, baseball, of course, the U.S. flag, buffalo fish, a black bullhead. This is chitlins, what they look like, and that broth. That's crab. It's like a Maryland blue crab. That is breaded and fried fatback. Several pieces of fried chicken. Fried fish and French fries. This is your guinea fowl. Looks like a turkey. Gumbo. Gumbo is popular down there in the New Orleans area. Ham hock and black-eyed peas. Fat pork joel. It's like bacon. That's what it looks like again. Hog maw. Hog maw is the pig stomach. So you hear black people, we talk about chitlins and hog maw. Well, you're dealing with pig's intestines and pig stomach. And, you know, it's funny, some of this food thought just black people ate. Well, you had the Chinese and you had other people that ate this food as well. They cooked it a little differently, but this is what we call our primary soul food as well. Chitlins and hog maws. Scrapple is another one. Guedo, liver mush. This is your savory rice dish. Now, that looks like jambalaya. That's what that is. And you see the celery, the onions, and the peppers. That's your trinity. And the shrimp and the sausage. That's jambalaya. That's famous. That's a Louisiana dish. Oxtails. That's what they are. It's a cow tail. You know, my mom fixes this all the time. Oxtails and some rice. You put oxtails and sauerkraut. Oysters. These are raw oysters. Pickled pig's feet. Pig's feet. Carrots, onions. This is pig on a rotisserie. Pork ribs. Chicken gizzards. Curry. Now, curry comes from Indians. Chipped beef on toast. You know what we call that? In the neighborhood, we call that shit on a shingle. You can have chipped beef on toast or sausage. You could have sausage gravy on toast. The same thing. This is shrimp. Turkey. There's a food garden. Apples. Peppers. That's what we use for seasoning. Black eyed peas. Smoked hogs. Cornbread. Cantaloupe. There's a cayenne pepper. Collard greens. Fresh collard greens. Corn on the cob. Cornmeal. Cucumbers. This is what you call melangenia. It's a fruit, more like a southern fruit. Fish peppers. This is what they made in Maryland. And I guarantee it's probably where Old Bay seasoning came from. Garlic balls and cloves. The gherkin. West African peppers. These are your herbs. Thought that white people ate thyme, oregano, and rosemary? Nope. Black people eat it too. Hoppin' John. It's got black eyed peas. It's got okra. It's got rice in it. It's got tomatoes, onions, potato, cola nuts, lima beans. There's also a bigger version of lima beans called butter beans, mustard greens, it's okra, roasted with margarine. You can saute it, fry it. It's deep fried okra. Onions. It's like a peach. Peanuts. That's a persimmon. Red peas. Sesame seeds. That's butternut squash. That's sweet potato. Tomatoes. Turnip greens. watermelon, red rice. That's cornbread. Back in the days, they used to cook it on the stove. It has jalapeno and onion in it, bacon, pork chops, and dirty rice. Grits, Johnny cake, white cornmeal, like some potato cakes. Use it as batter. Hush puppies, millet. It's grown in Ghana. Bowl of rice, white rice, red beans and rice. Sweet potato pie, banana pudding, red velvet cake, pecan pie, Hoppin' John again. Again, start right back at the top. Fried okra, fried chicken, macaroni and cheese, collard greens. But you have a variety of all. We went through the fruits and everything. Everything you saw here, breads and grains, and this African, that's millet. Um, millet is cook that in a pot with your vegetables. But that, and then of course you have your regional soul food. But basically, I brought this up because a lot of people don't know what soul food is, and I love soul food, collard greens. I just cook some cabbage. It's different cooking methods. I tend to season my foods, use sugar, and a lot of that is very good. Some of it I even looked at, like like red velvet cake. I didn't even know that was soul food. All the shellfish, the crabs. I knew the crabs were the seafood boil. That wasn't mentioned. That's soul food. Uh, white potato pie. That's also soul food. That's a Maryland dish. But it's still soul food. Sauerkraut and pig's tails. That's soul food. Biscuits, pancakes, sausage. That's soul food as well. Now, of course, that has some other influences, but it's basically a soul type of food because we used to eat it at the table. Tradition. Foods were high in calories because out in the field the slaves had to work. What else can I think? Ambrosia, the marshmallows, coconut. So we also eat Thanksgiving. Ham. It's another thing. Dressing. Some people call it stuffing. Dressing. That's also soul food. Um, what else? What else can I think of? That's meatloaf. Love meatloaf. See, a lot of the foods that I'm giving you, they're not expensive. Smothered pork chops with onions, liver. It's also soul food. Crab cakes, soul food. Oyster stew. fried green tomatoes. Again, I mentioned earlier, in the Mid-Atlantic states, they call it scrapple, where you take everything from the pig left, put some cornmeal, salt, pepper in it, grind it all up, put it in a loaf pan. In Ohio, they call it gueto, comes in a roll. Also, if it's grounded with liver and cornmeal, or liver mush. That's that's what we call it scrap. And there are green beans. It's another one. I cook green beans, bacon fat, salt, pepper, onion powder, garlic powder, tomato, potatoes, little white potatoes, onion, fresh green beans, broccoli. You can peas. That goes with everything. Um, mentioned different types of cornbread, hot water cornbread. Many of you are familiar with that. You get some drinks out there, Kool-Aid, Southern sweet tea. Chicken livers. So many other foods that weren't mentioned. But so what I wanted to do was just get a break from the politics, talk about soul food because oh yeah, I forgot about banana bread, carrot cake. Also, also forgot about zucchini bread, butternut squash pie, which is just like sweet potato pie, meat pie, or tomato pie. Tomato pie. It's more soul food. Chicken wings, fried chicken wings, baked chicken, mashed potatoes, gravies. That's that's what we've always eaten. And funny thing about soul food, it's spread out to other areas and it's had influence on the Europeans, the Asians. But basically, it was Africa, and you have to look at Native American. Well, basically, for the blacks in the deep South, that's where the soul food started. You include the Native Americans, that's where you have a Southern cuisine. But like I said, your your white folk, what they missed out on is you look at the Southern cuisine now, it's a delicacy, and we know how to cook it, season it, especially with macaroni and cheese. Heck, cucumber salad, it's another thing we eat. Deviled eggs, you name it, we eat it. Catfish, crawfish, crab soup. Those black people taken from the animals that roam the land, also that swim in the water. Frog legs, rabbit, possum, raccoon. But what I went over tonight was the evolution of soul food. Now we'll put the link in the bottom of the video and just wanted to just give you a history on something that around this time of year, we enjoy it because the spices come to life. Not that we don't enjoy it all year round, but this is a special time of year to where we all gather in the kitchen because celebrate, we give thanks, and You just enjoy eating some good food, good cooking. It's tradition. Soul food is tradition. Southern cooking is a tradition. And this video, you want to know more about it, just leave a comment in the comment section because I do cook soul food myself. And it is very, very good. A corn pudding, I forgot to mention that. Corn pudding, that's right. Corn pudding. That's another one. Apple cobbler, peach cobbler. Those are other ones. But tell me what you think about this video. And just want everybody to know that way to a man's heart is through his stomach. But give him some good old soul food. Because soul food is comfort food. And it tastes good. As long as it's seasoned correctly. And in the end, you're going to want more. Why? Because it's cooked very well and it's tasty. And you can have it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And that's my commentary for this edition of the 411 Talk Zone radio show right here on YouTube. If you like what I just presented, please comment, share, and subscribe. And if you're looking for some STEM, which I'll bring that video out tomorrow, you check out my second channel, the QCIS channel. On that channel, I give you a daily dose of science, technology, engineering, and of course, math. Now, here's where you can find me. Now, for my political content and social content, you can find me on the 411 Talk Zone radio show, which is on YouTube. You can also find me on X. You can find me on Rumble and True Social. As for the QCIS channel, you can find me on YouTube, you can find me on X, and you can also find me on LinkedIn. And in the end, I just want to say this. Always be blessed for what you have. Don't worry about what you don't have. Know that the sun always rises in the east and sets in the west. And if it doesn't apply, let it fly. But if the shoe fits, wear it. And if you don't like the shoe, change it. And once again, thank you for listening to this edition of the 411 Talk Zone radio show right here on YouTube. Until next time, my name is Leon Jones. I hope you all have a wonderful and gracious evening. God bless you.